reached. We do know that they deliberated for a little less than 3 hours. We do know that they had a lot to consider today as Jim Griffin made his final closing argument to this jury, trying to convince them that Alex Murdaugh is indeed a liar, but he said he is not a murderer and that he just would never, as a loving father and a loving husband, commit this type of heinous crime, committing the murders of his wife and his son. But Greg, Prosecutor Metters, we have talked all day about how effective he seemed to be in his closing, kind of summoning that attitude and that cadence of a Southern Baptist preacher, making that connection with the jury, talking about step by step through this case, how they drilled down on that timeline, and that in their eyes, even though much of the evidence was circumstantial evidence carries just as much weight as direct evidence. And in their eyes, because of that timeline that they were able to drill down, Metters tried to convince this jury that no one else could be responsible for these crimes.
The timeline that tightened throughout this trial and tightened even further when Alex Murdaugh himself got up on the witness stand and basically said that he was at the kennels up until 8:47 and then drove back to the house. Prior to that, you could only hear his voice on that cell phone video on Paul's phone at 8:44. But of course, he was there for a period of time. He took a chicken out of the dog Cash's mouth and then, according to him, got back on that golf cart and then quickly headed out of there. So 8:47 is when he left the kennels, showed up at the house at 8:50, 8:49, 8:50, and that's when prosecutors say that the murders happened. And so, yes, that timeline was so tight. And of course, Alex Murdaugh admitting on the stand that he lied about his whereabouts that night. He said he had never gone down to the kennels. He said that to law enforcement. He said it to anybody who would listen, to friends,
yes,
to family. And ultimately, it was that kennel lie that clearly was what the prosecution wanted to hammer to this jury, to say that Alex Murdaugh could not be trusted about the events of that night. Certainly a lot of circumstantial evidence in this case brought in from financial crimes and a roadside shooting, among other things. But ultimately, it came down to what happened in those critical moments,
yes,
before the murders that may have played very high in these jurors' minds.
I mean, Greg, you think about this. When you talk about that Snapchat video that Alex Murdaugh had no idea existed while he was lying to family, while he was lying to friends, while he was lying to his law partners, saying that he never went to those kennels. So that story changed once he discovered that evidence existed. And he admitted on the stand that it was his voice. He never denied that. But you think about where this case would have been, if this case would have even been brought by the prosecution, if they did not have that evidence that was collected, by the way, while Paul's phone was at a 2% battery. So even if that phone had died before he had been able to make that Snapchat video, we might have never known. We would have never known whatever those moments were that played out there at the kennel.
That was one of the keys of John Metters' presentation this afternoon, talking about where would we be right now were it not for that kennel video and were it not for those dogs. He said, had Alex Murdaugh not said on that video, Bubba, we may have never known that he was in fact there. So that was a big part of John Metters' presentation this afternoon. As you mentioned, it was fiery. It was thunderous at times, the cadence up and down, and he really kind of hammered all of those points to the jury. Jim Griffin, for his part, has said, you know, he tried to do his best today explaining why Alex Murdaugh would tell a lie like that. And essentially he blamed it on opioids and said it was paranoia. That was what Alex Murdaugh had said from the stand himself when he testified. But ultimately, you know, Jim Griffin, he had a pretty tall task because he had to overcome the credibility of his client before these jurors. And so when you had these closing arguments play out, you remember Creighton Waters' closing argument was exhaustive.
Yes.
It was 4 hours in which he taught about that motive pretty much ad nauseum for a good solid 2 hours as he began his closing argument. And some people said, you know, it seemed as though he was going a little slow, or he was, you know,
very
academic in the weeds. But by the afternoon, he really started to zero in on the events surrounding the night of June the 7th, 2021. And one of the other key pieces of evidence in all of this, Judy, was the OnStar data that was gleaned from the prosecution very late in this case, when they were able to determine Alex Murdaugh's exact whereabouts by the minute.
Yes.
that he pulled up to Moselle at 10:05 and then at 10:06, or he made a misdial of 911 at 10:05, but by 10:06 he was on a 911 call, a now infamous 911 call, where he said that he checked the pulses and had checked the victims, Paul and Maggie, both.
Yes.
And tried to turn Paul over. All of that would have had to have happened in a very tight window. So all of these are just little facets of the closing arguments that may have played very heavy on the jurors' minds as a verdict is reached in the case of Alex Murdaugh.
Listen, we have our crews back in the newsroom keeping an eye on things in the courtroom. As soon as we hear word that Judge Newman is on the bench, we will take you inside live. We are also outside of the courthouse. And let me just give you an idea of what happened behind the scenes, because our crew has been camped out here. We've been waiting. We had heard that the jury might deliberate until 8 o'clock tonight, might deliberate until 10 o'clock tonight. Then we heard it might go into the weekend, but we were all on standby. And literally about 10 minutes ago, we got the word that people were rushing into the courtroom, so we came and got in position. We saw Buster Murdaugh walk into the courtroom. Then we saw the defense attorneys walk into the courtroom. And at one time, they said they thought maybe a pool camera had been moved or that a juror just maybe had a question. But we have since learned, according to Court TV, this jury, in less than 3 hours, we're told that they finished deliberations and reached their verdict at 6:41 after starting those deliberations at 3:50. Our trial attorney, Carl Grant, is here with us. We're going to step in, check his microphone, and make sure that we've got him good to go, because Greg, Carl has told us from the outset that a quick jury, and so many pundits have expected a hung jury in this case.
That's
just
right.
Because
From
of
day one.
such a dispute between the two sides about the evidence, trying to, for the prosecution, use that Snapchat video to show they had a great family relationship. But for the defense tried to do that, and the prosecution saying that was evidence to really break that lie wide open. So, Carl,
yes,
as an experienced attorney of more than 30 years who has tried many murder cases, what do you make of the fact that we are getting a verdict from this jury in less than 3 hours?
I thought the deliberation was going to take much longer than it did. Now, if the jury is back that soon, either they were strongly convinced or strongly not convinced. It's just that clear. Now, I believe, of course, I don't want to just step
we don't want to speculate, and we're not going to get ahead of the process.
Right.
But you do have trial experience.
I do, yes.
And I don't know if you've had a case like this that you can maybe make some comparisons to, although this is a trial of the century. There are a lot of things in this case we've never seen before, but this jury had a lot to contemplate, and they did it in a short amount of time.
Let me tell you the rule that the defense normally goes by. The longer they deliberate, the better it is for us, because clearly they have some reasonable doubt. Okay? So now you have a short deliberation, then the opposite may be true. So that's obviously something to be concerned about if you're the defense attorney.
So much of this, especially when you talk about a short deliberation, we kind of set it up a little bit earlier on about how they were able to kind of get their hands on the evidence for the first time. Yesterday, jurors were able to go out to that crime scene at Moselle before they heard the closing arguments here, both from Creighton Waters and then today from Jim Griffin. How important do you think it was for them to be able to see that scene and kind of put the pieces together as these closing arguments came into focus?
Very, very important. In fact, that's one thing that I talked about. You got to be careful what you ask for, because the jurors could go out there and see things from a different perspective than what you thought they were going to see. It's my understanding that after they visited the crime scene, that the prosecution garnered another argument about the water hose and how he could possibly washed off at the scene of the crime. So that may be something that will come back. We'll find out later on after the jurors decide to talk to people, and they probably will, I'm sure. If that's the case, then that decision could have backfired.
Well, a lot of people are going to be waiting to see if, in fact, we hear from this jury after they have been approved to talk with the media, if they so desire, once we get this verdict. We have no idea what this verdict is at this point. We only know it took this jury less than 3 hours to reach it. Nick Neville is, of course, here as a part of our live team coverage as well. Nick, we've covered every single angle of these closing arguments yesterday and today, from Jim Griffin, from Meadors, who really literally had the last word to try and sway this jury one way or the other. I know you're over on the other side of the Colleton County Courthouse here. What are you seeing and hearing over there?
Right. Yes, Judy. So as you said, we just saw just a few minutes ago Buster Murdaugh and also the defense attorneys enter the courtroom again. So we have heard that a verdict has been reached here. I do want to talk a little bit about some of what we heard from John Meadors. This was the last message that jurors heard after 5.5 weeks of testimony, after the closing argument from Creighton Waters outlining that motive, that gathering storm of Alex Murdaugh's alleged financial crimes being exposed, the state alleging that to distract from that, to buy time, he murdered his wife and son. The state also alleging that for a period of time that actually worked because there was a motion to compel hearing in the 2019 fatal boat crash lawsuit that was canceled in the aftermath of the murders a few days after the murders. We want to get to Judge Newman.
Thank you. Madam Forelady, if you'll stand for me. Have you reached a verdict?
Yes, sir, we have.
Is it unanimous?
Yes, sir, it is.
All right, if you will pass it up to the clerk, who will pass it to me. And you may be seated. The defendant will rise. Madam Clerk, you may publish the verdict starting with the back, not with the, let's see, I'll tell you again. Starting with the back, flipping them over one by one.
Okay.
State of South Carolina versus.
Docket number 2022 GS 15-00592, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, in the Court of General Sessions in the term of 2022, July, the State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for murder, SC Code 16-3-0010, CDR Code 0116. You want me to turn it over? Okay. Guilty verdict. Signed by the forelady, 3-2-23. Docket number 2022-GS-15-00593, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, in the Court of General Sessions, the July term of 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for murder, SC Code 16-3-0010, CDR Code 0116, verdict guilty, signed by the forelady, date 3-2-23. Docket number 2022-GS15-00595, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, Court of General Sessions, July term 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant. Indictment for possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. SC Code -16-23-0490. CDR Code 0549. Verdict guilty. Signed by the foreperson of the jury. Date 3/2/23. Docket number 2022 GS-15-00594. The State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, Court of General Sessions, July term 2022. The State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant. Indictment for possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. SC Code 16-23-0490. CDR Code 0549. Verdict guilty. Signed by the foreperson of the jury. 3/2/23.
Thank you. Madam Forelady and members of the jury, if that is the verdict of each and every juror, please let it be known by raising your right hands. All right, thank you. Any individual polling requested?
We do, Your Honor.
Madam Clerk, you'll need to individually poll the jury according to their juror numbers.
Number 193. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 254.
Yes.
Is this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 326. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 530. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 544.
Yes.
Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 572. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 578. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 589. Was this your verdict? Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 630. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 729. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 826. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Juror 864. Was this your verdict?
Yes.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
Your Honor, the jury has been polled.
Thank you. The jury has been polled and the verdict is a unanimous verdict. If you will bring the alternate juror out and have her have a seat in the audience, please. You can stand there or you can sit back there, whatever you prefer. Okay. Are there any post-trial motions?
None from the state, Your Honor.
Your Honor, we would just renew our previously argued motions for a directed verdict, and at this, on the grounds, on those grounds, we would make a motion for a mistrial and to set aside the verdict.
By the state, response.
Your Honor, based on our previous arguments, we would submit that the case properly went to the jury and the verdict is proper, and we rely on those arguments.
We've been here now 28 days, first few days of jury selection, and the remainder receiving testimony, an overwhelming amount of testimony and evidence that was presented to the jury for the jury's consideration. As I indicated to the jury during the jury charge, or the charge on the law, that this was a matter solely for the jury to determine. The court found at the end of the state's case that there's sufficient evidence to find the defendant guilty if the evidence was believed by the jury. Likewise, at the end of the defense's case, when the motion was renewed, the court found that the evidence was sufficient for the jury to find the defendant guilty. The jury has now considered the evidence for a significant period of time, and the evidence of guilt is overwhelming, and I deny the motion. Mr. Murdaugh, you now having been found guilty of 2 counts of murder involving your wife and your son, 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, the burden now comes upon the court to impose a sentence. Given the lateness of the hour and the victim's rights that must be taken into consideration and complied with under the Victim's Bill of Rights, and consider what I would anticipate to be a number of people who might have something to say regarding sentencing, we will defer sentencing to a later date. Of course, the minimum sentence for murder is 30 years. The maximum sentence is life imprisonment as to each count. And on the weapons charge, the sentence is up to 5 years or 5 years, which has to be concurrent if a life sentence is imposed. When would you all like to reconvene for sentencing? I would like to give everyone an adequate opportunity to prepare for it.
State will be ready at 9:30 in the morning, Your Honor.
We could do it at 9:30 tomorrow morning also.
All right. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the Colleton County Sheriff's Department. And he may be taken away. Madam Foley and members of the jury, I want to thank you on behalf of the citizens of the state of South Carolina and your fellow citizens of Colleton County. You did not volunteer for this service. You were called upon by being summoned to appear, and Providence have brought you to this moment in time and these weeks in time. I know that all of you have been here at great sacrifice, particularly the juror whose job was on the line until a miracle happened, I guess, that allowed him to be able to leave rather than leave after 2 or 3 weeks. But I want to thank each one of you all individually and collectively. It's not often that you're called upon to sit in judgment of the actions of your fellow man, but you all responded and gave due consideration to the evidence I will make no comment now as to the extent or the overwhelming nature of the evidence, but certainly the verdict that you've reached is supported by the evidence, circumstantial evidence, direct evidence, all of the evidence pointing to only one conclusion. That's the conclusion that you all reached. So I applaud you all for, as a group and as a unit and individually, evaluating the evidence and coming to a proper conclusion as you saw the law, as you saw the facts. Now that you've served for the next year, you're not eligible to serve again. Now, of course, many people never get called upon, but you're not eligible for the next year, and for 2 additional years, you can be exempted from service because no person is required to serve on jury duty in this court more often than once every 3 years. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, we will reconvene for sentencing. You all have no role in that because that's solely up to the judge, to me. You're welcome to come back if you want to and be a part of the audience if you like. I also want to thank the alternate juror who was locked away in a room by herself for these hours, who's hung in there during that period of time. I want to thank you as well. Madam Clerk, what do you have to tell your jurors?
Thank you for your service and what the judge said as well. And I think we can release them tonight and bring them back in the morning.
No, they're off jury duty. They can come back if they like. And you don't have to if you don't want to. Typically, I've seen jurors wanting to see the end result of a case once they've invested a lot into it. It's really an amazing thing with juries. Quite often, at the start of the case, jurors are really like, whoa, why am I here? I wish I wasn't selected. But as time passes and the jurors become invested and really committed to the case and committed to seeing it through, and are very disappointed when they are not able to see it to a conclusion. And then along the way of serving, you end up finding out quite a bit about our judicial system and learning quite a bit, well, about human nature for sure, but also about the presentation of evidence and hearing from expert witnesses and really learning a lot of things that you'll be able to take with you when you leave jury duty. And to Madam Forelady, I don't know if you were hesitant initially or not, but you have stepped up to the plate and done a great job of leading the jury as well. And thank all of you. So the jury is dismissed. Now, one thing before you go, of course, we have invested a lot in maintaining the privacy of the jury, of each one of you. And you are free at this point to discuss the case with anyone. And given the high-profile nature of the case, I'm certain that the many people in the media will probably want to communicate with you, but they have no means of contacting you because under order that I issued, the identity of the jurors must be kept private. And if you decide that you want to speak with anyone, local, state, nationally, or internationally, that's your prerogative. However, Should anyone harass you, please let me know and I will address those issues. If anyone through the somehow or another discover your identity and harass you, and rest assured I will intercede on your behalf. That having been said, you are free to communicate with whomever you might want to concerning the case from now on. And so with that, thank you, and you all are free to go.
Judge, if I could
Yes.
If I could have you go to the jury room, and I'm going to meet you back there for just a few minutes.
All right.
Gather your belongings.
And as is my practice, I'll speak with the foreperson before you leave the building after talking to them back there. Anything else?
Welcome back to our live team coverage here on WIS News 10. As promised, we were going to stay here at the Colleton County Courthouse until this jury reached a verdict. Greg, it took less than 3 hours. But if you step back and take a look at what we have seen transpire here over the last several weeks and look at this guilty verdict on all counts for Alex Murdaugh tonight, Greg, you cannot overlook the fact that this guilty verdict in this case came at the very courthouse where his family, his father and his grandfather created such a legacy. And you look at the tragedy of this case, the impact on this town and certainly on his family and the many victims that he has talked about in this trial. I believe that's part of the reason why the judge deferred the sentencing to tomorrow, because he said that he expects there are many people who will want to speak out regarding that sentencing. But the news tonight, this jury took very little time to decide and reach a conclusive verdict, a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges.
In just about 3 hours, it was unanimous, it was quick, it was decisive, guilty on all counts. And an emotionless Alex Murdaugh stood to hear those verdicts. We saw tears from Alex Murdaugh at many times during this trial, but tonight there were no tears. His family was inside as well. They quickly exited the courtroom, but again, guilty on all of those charges, guilty of murder of his wife and his son in cold blood at Moselle, which is just about 30 minutes from here on the family's hunting property. And Judy, you mentioned it and set the stage here in the Colleton County Courthouse. There was a photo of his grandfather who served as the solicitor here. The Murdaugh family has presided over the 14th Circuit Solicitor's Office for close to a century. Alex Murdaugh had that solicitor's badge. He argued cases in this courtroom, and today he received a verdict of guilty. Guilty on all of those counts. Now again, sentencing will be tomorrow at 9:30 a.m.
We have I didn't want to interrupt, Greg, but we do have the jury walking out of the courtroom. The judge has said that they are now free to speak with the media if they wish. If they don't want to speak to the media, Judge Newman said that he will certainly intervene if necessary. But he even talked, and we'll bring Carl in for some analysis as well, but Judge Newman even talked about one of these jurors, because this trial drug on for so long that the defense team had to move out of the accommodations that they made where they were going to work here for this trial, because they did not expect it to become this lengthy. But there was one juror whose job was on the line if they didn't make some special accommodation. So Judge Newman made a point tonight to thank these jurors for their service and their time and their dedication in evaluating this evidence in this case to reach this verdict tonight.
And we can't say enough about Judge Newman in many ways throughout this process and the way he handled this proceeding. Even when a juror was dismissed earlier on today, he was very cordial, thanked them for their service. He did the same tonight for the remaining jurors. But again, as they make their way out, certainly they've rendered a verdict that has shockwaves throughout not only this state but also across the country. Many people with eyes on this trial, and they delivered a resounding verdict, guilty on all counts. Carl, it was 3 hours that they made that decision. Was their mind made up? Do you think they were swayed in any way, shape, or form during these closing arguments? We talked about this to a great degree, just how both sides were really kind of jockeying for that final argument. But the question was, did they already have a sense of where they were going with these verdicts?
Greg, I really do believe, and I've said it then and I say it now, because I remember feeling, as a defense counsel, feeling that gut punch when I found and heard out that Alex decided to testify, and then when he got on the witness stand and admitted that he lied. Once he did that, I honestly said to myself, I think that's really the end of the case. And that's why I always say you follow the advice of your attorney. Even lawyers hire lawyers because they're too close to it. And in this case, you may think you're the smartest person in the world, but that's why you hire attorneys and you follow the advice of your attorneys. But let me say, not just as a trial lawyer, but as an American, what about this wonderful American judicial system that we have here in this country, where you have the right to a jury trial, you can challenge the evidence, you can have lawyers to defend you, and that's a wonderful thing. And I just want to say that I'm happy to live in a country where at least we have those type of constitutional rights.
Well, I can hear people watching tonight saying amen in their living room. Carl, a couple of key moments that I wonder what impact they may have had on the trial. Obviously, you brought up the most obvious with him deciding to testify against his lawyer's advice. And then the audacity to get on the stand and lie to this jury, which the prosecution demonstrated about getting the blue lights added to the car. But when you move even past his testimony, what about the decision? And both sides agreed not to request a change of venue because for the defense, I wonder if they thought, Greg, that maybe, hey, he's in his backyard. People here know this family. We have a reputation here. It will overcome these charges as it has overcome a lot of controversy in the past. But the prosecution bet on the fact that it was time for him to pay.
That's right.
For all of this to come to bear. And everything that, all the lies that he had told to really come to bear.
Yeah, and probably betting on the fact that his name had been tainted because of all the things that he'd done and all the various victims, especially the financial crimes as well, which was able to get into evidence. So they thought because he'd been vilified by so many incidents that occurred, maybe we won't ask for a change of venue. So I have two different thoughts on that. I was initially thinking what you mentioned, that the backyard thing, trying this case in his own backyard. But the prosecutor probably said exactly what I've talked about just now. Well, wait a minute. Yeah, he's in his own backyard, but look at all the things he's done to the various people in his own backyard. So change of venue, maybe not.
One of the big things from Creighton Waters, especially when he was making his final argument to the jury yesterday, was when he was talking about Alex Murdaugh and his pattern of lies, that he was a pathological liar in many ways, and talked to those jurors and said, don't let what happened to all of his victims happen to you. Meaning, don't let him lie to you from the witness stand. Hold him accountable for his lies. And it would appear, and you really have to give the hat tip at this time to Creighton Waters and the state's prosecution team, including the Attorney General of our state, Alan Wilson, who questioned the final witness, Ken Kenzie, the forensic analyst, and gave a pretty convincing blowback to what was the defense's biggest argument of possibly two shooters or the possibility that the wounds came from different places. Alan Wilson sat behind his team for 5.5 weeks, and then he got up and he argued very effectively to that jury, laying out that argument to them very succinctly and guiding Kenneth Kenzie through that testimony. It spoke a lot to him, I would say, and backing up his team. And then in prime time, when it counted, he got up and delivered the goods.
He stood in the trenches. And in fact, I'll say this. Alan Wilson has great litigation skills. As a trial lawyer who's seen many, many trial lawyers, he has good trial lawyer skills. And he brought those to the table. And of course, not only that, but he brought his political reputation to the table. When you think about it, the defense hired a veteran trial lawyer who's also a state senator. Well, the prosecution said, we'll see you a state senator and raise you the attorney general.
Yes, actually, we see the Murdaugh defense team walking out. We see Dick Harpootlian, as well as Jim Griffin. Looks like they are stopping and speaking with reporters. Our Nick Neville is roving at this time. We hope that he'll be able to get over there and possibly
hope that Nick can get over
some reaction from Dick Harpootlian. in the aftermath of these verdicts.
And let me give a heads up to our crew back in the newsroom, and also to Nick, because he probably is trying to track down the defense attorneys. But I've confirmed with the Attorney General's office that the Attorney General, Alan Wilson, you were just talking about his litigation skills. He will be holding a news conference here in front of the courthouse in about 20 minutes. So we hope to bring that to you live as well. Just putting the whole team on notice as I'm sharing that with you so that we can try and make that happen and bring it to you live. And Carl, as you talk about Alan Wilson, let's talk about him in just a moment, because that news conference will be coming up. But let's go back to the jury for a moment.
Yes.
Because, Greg, we had that jury dismissed this morning.
That's right.
That juror, one juror, a female juror, dismissed this morning. And Dick Harpootlian vigorously objected because he said at some point the SLED agent, remember, had interviewed this witness. Now, Judge Newman made it clear the court did not interact with SLED at all in making the decision to dismiss this juror. They interviewed this juror, found out this juror had had conversations with people outside of the jury, and more importantly, had offered some sort of opinion. But I wonder, Greg, if that juror, for whatever reason, you know, they're analyzing the jury all the time and kind of trying to figure out and read the tea leaves to see which way they're leaning, and it only would have taken one. It only would have taken one, and I wonder if Dick Harpootlian thought that was his best shot. Yeah,
I bet he did, because only one juror to create what is called a hung jury. And sometimes that happens. He probably was thinking that. And the Attorney General's office and the solicitor, I should say the Attorney General, prosecuting this case, they thought better of it and said, well, we got to make the challenge because we found out this juror has violated the court's oath. Now, here's the point. Oftentimes, if a juror does that, the juror is not sent home. The juror is sent to jail. I know of a story where a juror's cell phone went off in the courtroom and the judge put the juror in jail. So for a case on this magnitude, for you to violate the judge's directions and orders to not talk about things before you're supposed to, that's a serious violation. So she's fortunate that she's home tonight.
Because, Greg, even when they went out to Moselle, Judge Newman made it clear, you all are not to talk to each other out there. You are not to talk about this case. And even if jury deliberations had gone into the overnight hours where they were going to come back tomorrow to continue deliberations, he told them, you're going to have your cell phones, you'll be at home, and you'll have the typical access you would have to TV and, you know, the internet and all of that. But he admonished them that they would not be allowed to look at news headlines. They would not be allowed to research this case. They would not be allowed to speak with anyone about the case, and certainly not to offer an opinion on it. But as you mentioned at the top of the show, this jury went in, and clearly they were of like mind to be able to reach this verdict so quickly.
There was many times throughout this trial where the defense called for a mistrial. You heard many of the analysts and pundits prior to the trial talking about that exact possibility that you just laid out, Carl, and that there might be a hung jury in this case. Many were convinced that it would be a hung jury even into closing arguments up until today. But this was resounding. It was unanimous, it was decisive, and it was swift. And so, you know, so many of maybe the things that from the outside, especially when talking about some of the jurors' demeanor, we had heard different reporting about how the jurors were responding to some of this testimony. All of that seems to fade away quite quickly when a jury like this comes back and is able to render a verdict in such a quick fashion. So I just wanted to get your take on that, Carl. When it comes to a hung jury, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the most probable outcome in a case like this. So as soon as you hear that there's a unanimous verdict, that almost tips the hand as to what's going to happen.
And it tells you that the jurors thought the evidence was strong, very strong. And how about the vindication of Creighton Waters by this verdict?
Yes.
He was vilified, okay, about the crazy motive that he used. Well, now he's won the case. All right, he got the verdict. He obtained justice on behalf of the victims. So he's been vilified by this. So I think that justice has been served. And now, because I believe in the jury system. I really do believe in the jury system. And now the judge has to determine what he wants to do when it comes to sentence tomorrow morning.
We did hear from the judge. Usually, and Carl, you told this about this earlier, that typically in a murder case, sentencing would come immediately following the verdict. But because the lateness of the hour tonight, Judge Newman said he expected there will probably be a number of people who would want to participate in that hearing and provide testimony in one fashion or another. So in consideration of that, and after consulting with attorneys on both sides, they agreed that they would return at 9:30 in the morning for that sentencing hearing. We'll be able to talk with Carl about what the sentencing options are here in just a moment, but I wanted to let you know we have that live shot up of where the news conference will be held. I have confirmed with the Attorney General's office that news conference will be happening now, probably in the next 10 to 15 minutes, so we will bring that to you live when it happens. But Greg, as we talk about John Meadors as well, in addition to Creighton Waters, I mean, he was the one who brought the heat, the smoke, the fire, everything today in that closing argument. In those final moments, he had to sway this jury.
The state's attorneys had received a lot of blowback at times during this trial. Creighton Waters in particular, as they talked about his meandering with some of this evidence and saying it seems so tedious and in the weeds, you know, spending days on specific steps, and of course all of the financial evidence that got brought into this, you know, tracing the forensic trail of all of the money going in and out of Alex Murdaugh's accounts. And so all of this testimony took days. I mean, obviously we're on day 28 of this trial. So much of it, at least in real time, there was some real frustration and almost kind of like a collective sigh of, you know, here he goes again with just another long sidewinder when it comes to evidence. But ultimately, all of it, it would seem, made such an incredible impact and delivered the impact clearly that the state wanted to put before that jury, that in fact there was an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, some of which turned into direct evidence and ultimately incontrovertible evidence for this jury.
Yes.
Absolutely. And our Nick Neville has done a tremendous job as a part of our live team coverage here. He has his microphone in position to make sure you don't miss that news conference. So when it starts, we'll go to that news conference live again with the Attorney General giving reaction to his office winning this case, convicting Alex Murdaugh on all 4 charges that he faced, including the murders of his wife and his son. Carl, let's talk a little bit about the instructions that Judge Newman gave this jury today, because it made it clear to them, he made it clear to them that they, and they only, were the finders of facts.
That's right.
That he would not offer them beyond the instruction of the law. He would not offer them any guidance, suggestions, or opinions, that they needed to evaluate the evidence, that they should not consider themselves owing anyone any favors, that they could not consider this in terms of what they thought the law should be, but what the law is.
That's right. Normally, a jury is told you have no enemies to punish and you have no friends to reward. Your friend in this case is simply the truth. Find the truth and everybody will be happy. Maybe not the defendant in this case, but find the truth. And that's your role as a juror. And follow the instructions given by the judge. Weigh the credibility of the witnesses. Look at their demeanor. Are there any inconsistencies in their testimony? What about their credentials? All of these things go to the credibility of any witness, and the jurors make the decision as to the facts, determining the facts, and the judge is the decision maker on the law.
Just got an update from the Attorney General's office. The news conference is scheduled now to start at 8 p.m. So when it happens, we'll be ready to bring that to you live. But Greg, we've talked so much, and Carl put it best earlier, the why versus the lie, right? It really came down to believability.
Yep.
Ultimately, it became a test of believability, and Alex Murdaugh failed that test, clearly. So many of the witnesses in this case, you talk about what perhaps was the most compelling pieces of evidence. Clearly, that kennel video at 8:44 that busted Alex Murdaugh's alibi that we talked about at the top of this broadcast when we broke in to talk about a verdict. It was that kennel video that busted his alibi, showed him at the scene of the crime, placed him there when really he had said for so long that he wasn't there. And ultimately, that was a big piece of evidence. But also, I think some of the ballistics evidence in this was also very convincing. When they said that some of the shells that were found outside of the gunroom at the Moselle property were found next to Maggie Murdaugh, and that they were cycled through the same weapon, a missing .300 blackout that belonged to the Murdaughs. Again, that's a powerful piece of evidence for the jury to consider, because in order for that weapon to be used, and it was established that it was used, jurors would have to believe that maybe it was stolen and that whoever stole it then came back to the property to commit these murders. Seems like a tall task when you talk about just the logistics of how this played out. So Creighton Waters, for all of the intricacies and for all of, Paul Greer was the person who testified to this. He wasn't exactly the most exciting guy on that witness stand,
Right.
but he was able to piece that together so quickly. to really kind of button up a forensic, the closest thing to direct forensic evidence in this case were those shell casings. That was very big and very key. Couple that with some of the technological evidence with the cell phone video at the kennels, as well as the Snapchat video showing him wearing a different article of clothing that was never found later. These were things I'm sure that weighed on that jury very heavily, Carl.
Absolutely,
Absolutely.
absolutely. And, you know, when I think about the fact that Creighton stuck with his theory. All the criticism that he received, he stuck with his theory. Over and over again, he stuck with his theory. Also, imagine, if you will, how many times a person watching television said, "Not another financial crimes witness."
They sure did.
Over
They
and
sure
over
did.
again. No, please, not another financial crimes witness. But it worked. It worked. And that prosecutor, that lawyer, has been vindicated for all of the criticism he's received from many trial lawyers that I know in many different corners. He has been vindicated.
And one other aspect we had to remind people about was that when we were listening to those, we call them trials within the trial, right?
Yeah.
When
Yes.
they had those hearings.
That's right.
Right.
So the viewing audience heard it ad nauseum, right?
Yes.
So but by the time the jury heard it, they only heard it one time.
That's right.
So you had to kind of mentally, make that check to make sure that to have a better perspective of what the jury might have been processing and whether it felt that same way
Right.
to them. But Carl, here's what we go back to with the believability, as you said earlier, the why versus the lie. It all comes back to that Snapchat video, Greg.
It does.
And when Alex Murdaugh was forced, he didn't just volunteer that he was there. He was backed in a corner and was forced to admit that that was his voice on that video. But even when you dissect that, Carl, the question is, when you go back into the immediate hours following those murders, in the very first video that we saw where they entered it into evidence, where he was talking to those officers on scene, he initially said he lied because he didn't trust SLED. And then the prosecution pushed back and said, well, SLED wasn't even on the scene.
Yes.
Then he lied and said, well, it was because of my paranoia, because of the drug addiction. So they had to try and thread that needle to say, you're taking enough drugs to tell lies and to be paranoid, but not enough to be out of your mind to commit murder. And so just the believability factor
Right.
in terms of trying to rehabilitate the client on the stand. As Greg said earlier, Jim Griffin had a monumental task today.
He was trying to make chicken salad with chicken feathers, and that's hard to do in a trial. I can tell you that right now. The thing about it, too, Judy, is when you think about, again, going back to what Creighton has done in this case, and his team, they had a difficult task. It's hard to win a case with just circumstantial evidence. I mean, it really is. Although the law allows you to do it, most people look for what? Where's the proof? Where's the direct evidence? You don't have a confession. You don't have a gun. You don't have an eyewitness. That's the foundation and the basis of starting off with a murder charge. You got to have solid evidence, and he did not have that in this case. But he had convincing evidence, and the most convincing evidence that he had in this case was the defendant's own words, saying he was at the scene of the crime minutes before the victims were killed, and to the exclusion of any reasonable possibility that anybody else could have come there to do so.
Yep, that's
Yeah.
an excellent point, Carl. And we have plenty more from here outside of the courthouse in Walterboro, where a jury just convicted Alex Murdaugh of murder of his wife and his son, guilty on all charges. Plenty more coverage from here outside the courthouse as our live coverage of the Alex Murdaugh murder trial continues after this.
This was it? WIS is supporting our veterans through United for Veterans, and you can help by signing up for the Fairways to Freedom Golf Tournament, March 20th at Cobblestone Park. United for Veterans is sponsored by Bathfitter and Palmetto State Armory.
This was it? We shouldn't have ignored that musty smell and been breathing this for so long.
I understand. Lots of people don't realize that mold feeds off moisture in their crawl space.
Well, let's cut off the cause of this mold.
The effects of water can be surprising, but at Mount Valley Foundation Services, we'll do a complete home inspection for free, so you can put water back in its place. Schedule a free home inspection today.
WIS News 10 in HD is sponsored by McWhorter, Bellinger & Associates. I'm Pat McWhorter. If you've been hurt in a car wreck, call McWhorter, Bellinger & Associates today.
Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Fashion takes a front row seat. Rug & Home is pulling out all the stops. 70 and 20% off hundreds of rugs. Many others priced to go or on final clearance. In stock and ready to take home today. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Rug & Home.
Introducing Astapro Allergy, steroid-free allergy relief that starts working in 30 minutes, while other allergy sprays take hours. Now with Astapro Fast Allergy Relief, you can Astapro and go.
We're pulling out all the stops, and fashion takes a front row seat. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. 70 plus 20% off hundreds of rugs, 0% financing, and hundreds of furniture, rugs, and accessories priced to go or on final clearance. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Rug & Home.
Hurt on the job? Don't take any chances. Just call Joy.
This is Alex Murdaugh at 4147 Moselle Road. I need the police to answer immediately. My wife and child shot badly.
This is your wife and son?
Did I kill my wife? Just no, David. It's just so bad. They did it so bad.
There's not one shred of evidence.
One question begets another, which begets another.
I go by Buster.
Do you have any idea who's done this?
Welcome back to our live team coverage. As we listened to the open there, you heard so much saying, Dick Harpootlian, we don't have one shred of evidence. Greg, clearly the jury did not agree with that tonight. Judy Gatson, along with Greg Adeline, our Nick Neville is standing by for the Attorney General's news conference. We have been told it's going to happen at 8 o'clock. As soon as it happens, we will bring it to you live. Carl B. Grant is standing by, expert analysis as a trial attorney, so he'll be weighing in momentarily. But Greg, this really came down to believability. Yes, it was a circumstantial case, but the prosecution clearly able to connect the dots and convince this jury that there is no one else who had the opportunity, and although motive was not required, they gave this jury the questions and the answers that they were looking for in terms of why he committed these crimes.
They certainly did. And again, as we said, certainly have to tip your hat to the prosecutors in this case because they ultimately didn't have a ton of direct evidence to work with, but there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, and of course they had the defendant himself getting on the stand. Basically, his attorneys didn't want him to get up there, but he did nonetheless, and it was that move Carl describing just a moment ago that he believes was likely a fatal error in many ways, shapes, and forms, because after all, you can say things that can incriminate yourself from the stand. Different things, especially when he got drilled on that timeline.
Yes.
When they started to ask him about specific conversations that he was having with his wife at the kennels. You know, Creighton Waters was just walking him through a minute-by-minute accounting from 8:44 until 8:50. 8:50 was the time of the murders, and he was just kind of walking him through saying, well, what did you say to your wife then? When did you get up out of the golf cart and take that chicken out of the dog's mouth? All of those things, I'm certain, made such a big impression on that jury to say that, you know, because Alex Murdaugh did not have the best answers at that point. He said that, you know, he couldn't recall that final conversation. There were certain things in this case, and of course in his testimony, that he was crystal clear on.
Right.
But when it came to certain things, he just was vacant of any possible plausible answer, and ultimately that made an impression on the jury.
And I think that did make an impression on the jury, Greg, because how can you be crystal clear on every single fact that aids your defense, but be so confused and paranoid and delusional about things that might not reflect well upon you? And so that is what we heard from Alex Murdaugh on the stand, and they just didn't believe him. And Carl, one of those key moments that I have been thinking about ever since they said it during this trial, when they questioned Alex Murdaugh, what were your last words, you know, to your wife? And we talked about anybody who's lost a loved one.
Yes.
You remember the final words, the last time you saw them, you remember exactly how that played out. And he said, he paused as if he was deliberating, but said he could not remember. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that you would remember, but I think the prosecution was able to drive that point home.
You remember the details of traumatic events. And like I said earlier, when it comes to the witness's demeanor, a witness's demeanor is evidence in a case. It is evidence in a trial. And that's one of the charges that the judge gives the jury. You can evaluate the witness's demeanor. Now let's talk about Alex's demeanor in this case. his demeanor on the witness
Carl,
stand.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want
please
to check
do.
in with our team. I can't hear in my IFB, but I see the reporters have gathered around outside of the courthouse, and I thought that I heard the Attorney General speaking in the background. So if somebody can give us a heads up and let us know if he's talking yet, we want to make sure that we hear that entire news conference when it happens. I know it's a little bit before 8 o'clock. And I'm waiting
Not
to
going
get.
quite yet.
Okay, great. I just wanted
You
to be
still
sure I
see
saw
that
the
guy
lines.
there.
All right, Carl. Sorry to interrupt, but we
that's
just
okay.
want to make live TV. But we want to make sure we don't miss, especially comments from the Attorney General after winning such a big case.
I was talking about Alex's demeanor on
Yes.
the witness stand. He's not just the defendant, but when he takes the witness stand, he is a witness, of course. He is a witness defendant. Now, let's talk about his demeanor. Apparently, and it seemed to me, his demeanor was this. I am going to show to you, Creighton Waters, that I'm a better trial lawyer than you are.
Yeah.
I'm going to match wits with you. I'm going to show you that I'm smarter than you are. I'm more persuasive than you are. And any question that you throw my way, bring it on. I'm ready. What other questions do you have of me, Mr. Waters?
What other questions do you have of me, Mr. Waters?
That's such a great point, because you saw in every single question that Alex Murdaugh, most of the questions that he was asked on that witness stand, he would ask them back to the prosecutor. So if he was asked if he was at the kennels, he'd repeat the question back. Was I at the kennels? Well, and he would then go into his answer. It seemed as though he was very deliberative, and he was answering it much like a lawyer would answer it, often parsing words and being very careful with his answers and crafted. In his direct examination with Jim Griffin, he turned directly to the jury and seemed to be playing to the jury at that time. And of course, when Creighton Waters cross-examined him, he was speaking directly to Creighton Waters. And so you just wonder if at any time, and Creighton Waters was very smart to do this, to point it out to that jury, to say, he's playing you. Don't let him play you. He's convincing. He knows how to convince a jury. He's been in a courtroom for years. He comes from a deep legal legacy. He knows how these things are done, and he knows how to convince a jury. Ultimately, I think the jury was listening to Creighton Waters.
I think they listened to him, absolutely, Greg, and they were convinced and persuaded by his argument. For those who are just joining us, Alex Murdaugh has been convicted on all 4 charges, including the murders of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. Let's take a moment, listen to a brief moment in the courtroom when the judge spoke after that verdict came down.
Mr. Murdaugh, you now having been found guilty of 2 counts of murder involving your wife and your son, 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime,
A live news conference with Attorney General Alan Wilson, who was very convincing during his participation in this trial, participating in the direct examination of some witnesses. And Carl, 2 points I want to cover with you, because in his instructions to the jury, Judge Newman made several points, but 2 that I found particularly compelling, especially in light of this verdict. He told them the believability of witnesses was very important, and that you could use that to weigh their testimony. He also pointed out the fact that expert testimony, they don't have to believe it. It's just an opinion. It doesn't carry any more weight compared to other witnesses in this case. But when we think about the expert testimony and we think about the Attorney General and his direct examination and Dr. Kinsey, because Greg, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but they had 1 or 2 very compelling demonstrations in this courtroom where they demonstrated, the prosecution demonstrated the defense's theory in this case, and they really demolished it, just showing as a matter of fact with the logistics and how narrow the doorway was and how long the gun was, that the defense's theory of how this crime played out, in his words, was preposterous.
Yes, yes. The arguments made by the prosecution were very, very compelling, very compelling. And I believe that's what won the day. They themselves appeal to common sense, demonstrating, of course, number one, if you didn't do this crime, how was there enough time for somebody else to do it? Where did they come from in 3 to 5 minutes?
And where did they go?
And where did they go? And who shows up to commit murder and doesn't even have their own gun? Who would do that? So that's a logical point that they made, and I believe that when you weigh the credibility of the witnesses and the believability of the presentation from the other side, the jury decided the prosecution had the strong case, and it did not take them long. I said a while back in my discussions with you guys that this has really become a one-issue case now. Do you believe Alex Murdaugh or you don't? And if you don't believe him, it would be a short deliberation, and that's the conclusion the jury came to.
That is exactly what happened. You talked about some of those powerful moments, Judy. Alan Wilson picking up a Vanelli shotgun at one point and holding it over Kenneth Kinsey. Kenneth Kinsey, again, just to talk about him, was so plain-spoken and was so polite. And just the way in which he handled himself on that witness stand, very convincing. He came up twice. He was a rebuttal witness. He came up even prior to that to talk about shotgun trajectories and to talk about the scene itself. And you have to wonder, that jury headed to Moselle, again, right before closing arguments. And so they were fresh off of listening to Kenneth Kinsey talk about how it all played out. And they were able to see that door frame at the feed room themselves.
Yes, they were.
They were able to compare it, and they were able to see who was telling the better version of events of what happened there. Was it a paid expert from out of state, upstate in Connecticut, or was it Kenneth Kinsey, somebody who has been on many different crime scenes, who has testified in many different trials, the credibility of the witness himself, somebody who has been involved in these cases and was able to explain it to the jury in such a way that he ultimately became a very powerful witness. And the state, you could say, was very smart to put him as their final rebuttal witness.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the other thing I noticed about him, Carl, I'm keeping an eye on the time, 7:57. We are standing by for a news conference from the Attorney General, Alan Wilson. I assume it'll be the entire prosecution team. They have put a lot of work in this case to reach this conclusion tonight, where the jury has found Alex Murdaugh guilty of all 4 charges. But, Carl, as we go back to Mr. Kinsey, Dr. Kinsey, I should say, as Greg said, he was so plain-spoken, but what I also noticed, and I think it may have added to his credibility with the jury, he had the same demeanor with the prosecution as he did with the defense.
He did.
He did.
His demeanor was very even. There were some witnesses who were either more aggressive or more combative, depending on who called them as a witness. But his testimony felt like it was right down the middle of the line, based on the science, and every opinion that he offered, he said, let me show you why. Let me show you why. And he explained it. You know, he's an instructor at some of our local colleges here. I'm like, now you make me want to go back to science class, because he explained it in a way where you could grasp it and understand it and try to really figure this out. And let me tell you something else. We've been here, you've been here a very long time. Let me just give you and Nick the Endurance Award, and a shout out to all of our local media. We've talked a little bit about this. There's been so much misinformation spread about this trial, but local media from top to bottom has done a tremendous job. This has been a huge story in our backyard, and I'm so proud of our team and the way that we have been able to cover that. But just in the few days that I've been down here in Walterboro, I went out last night. I actually forgot some stuff I needed in the media room, so I ended up going out. It was pretty late last night. It was after 10 o'clock. Carl, it's dark on these streets, and it is quiet.
It is.
And I'm not going to say how fast I drove down the road, but it was a 45-mile-per-hour road. And I thought about the testimony where they said he was driving 74, 76 miles per hour. When I got up past 50, that felt fast on that road. Now, I wasn't on his road, so, you know, this is just like everybody going around throwing their cell phones. You see in all those videos on social media, if they had the cell phone testimony, everybody started tossing their phones, trying to see, did the backlight come on and all of that. But my point is this. It is so quiet out here in Walterboro, in this quiet corner of South Carolina. I also thought about gunshots. If I heard them, if they went off, you know, in the quiet of the night. You know, I feel like the defense raised the right questions about the credibility, Carl, of what made sense.
Common sense. That's really what it's all about. If it doesn't fit with common sense, then more than likely, in your life's experiences.
Yes.
Like I said earlier, when jurors come to court, and I've told them this many times in opening statements, you came here, you parked your cars, but you did not park your common sense.
Yes.
And that's what they use to come to the decisions, common sense, based upon what? Evidence. And that's how they came to the decision in this case.
Credibility and common sense were huge themes today in not only Jim Griffin's closing argument, but also in John Meddar's rebuttal, saying, follow your common sense. And that was one of the things with Creighton Waters' opening statement. When you go back and listen to that opening statement, it was 33 minutes at the beginning of this trial, and he never overpromised to this jury. Everything that he said he had in this case, that the state had in this case, they introduced it, and they were able to dot I's and cross T's. They didn't make any false promises in that investigation. So let's get to that press conference right now.
You can hear the cheers behind us. Yeah.
God bless you.
Y'all might have to come around to the side. Y'all be patient. There's a lot of us coming out. How are we on the mic check? Thumbs up. Thank you. We got our team out here. Wow. What a great day for the people of South Carolina. I want to thank every one of you for being here tonight. There's a lot of emotion here tonight at this courthouse. A lot of a year and a half, nearly 2 years of blood, sweat, and tears, it feels like. A lot of hard work from so many people. So if you will just bear with me, there's a lot of people I have to thank. But first, those of you who don't know, I'm Alan Wilson. I'm South Carolina's Attorney General, and I got the best staff of any Attorney General in the United States of America. I want to start by thanking our prosecution team. I want to tell you, I've been here for nearly 6 weeks with this team, living in a hotel, and it felt almost like being in a dorm environment in college. Late nights, cramming, studying, little sleep, away from our families, getting up early, getting here to the courthouse, working long hours, getting on each other's nerves at times, but it was all worth it. It was all worth it because we got to bring justice and be a voice for Maggie and Paul Murdaugh and bring justice for the people of South Carolina. I'd like to start real briefly by thanking our team. First, excuse me, let me put my glasses on. Our chief prosecutor, I tell you, I appointed Creighton Waters to be the chief prosecutor of this case nearly a year and a half ago. And I want to say I'm pretty brilliant because I picked the right guy. And I want to say thank you to Creighton Waters. Creighton, you did a fantastic job. I don't think there's another attorney in the state of South Carolina that could have led this Herculean effort. But Creighton will be the first to tell you he didn't do it alone because he had a team of people. I want to first thank Don Zelinka, who is actually Creighton's boss. He is the Deputy Attorney General, been in the Attorney General's office for over 40 years. Sitting here to my immediate left, Don Zelinka, thank you so much. John Metters, many of you got to see him do the closing argument today. John, thank you. You've been a phenomenal add to our team. I'm going to go quickly through the names, but as I read the names, please raise your hand. You know Creighton, you saw Don, and you see John. David Fernandez, John Conrad, Johnny James, Savannah Gowd, Ozzie Toledo,
Yes.
Shane Aceto,
Yes.
Carly Jewell,
Yes.
Carson Burney,
Yes.
Danielle Colon,
Yes.
and our victims advocate, Tricia Allen.
Yes.
I also want to say thank you to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Mark Keel assigned some amazing men and women. And when I said it was an agency-wide effort on behalf of SLED, I can't underscore that part enough. Every time I called Chief Keel, every time I reached out to the lead agents, every time Creighton was asking me, hey, General, we need something from SLED, we would reach out to SLED, and they were there. They busted their butts. I can't begin to list every agent, and some can't be listed for obvious reasons. Some are standing up here tonight. I told them I wasn't going to mention their names, but we would not be here if it wasn't for SLED. And I want to thank Mark Keel and his team and all of the men and women across the entire state law enforcement division for what they did to make tonight a possibility.
Amen.
I also want to thank the FBI and the Secret Service, our federal partners. We had to utilize many of their assets and resources. We couldn't do all the things that we did without our federal partners. We had a lot of local partners. We had the Colleton County Sheriff's Department, Buddy Hill, Sheriff Hill and his team, providing the security. They did a phenomenal job, and they were there. They were the first responders the night on June 7th, 2021, when Maggie and Paul were butchered brutally. They were the first responders, and they were the first ones to be there. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office, the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office were instrumental in supporting our investigative efforts. You all know Kenny Kinsey, our chief crime scene expert, was with the Orangeburg Sheriff's Office. I also want to thank the city of Walterboro. I think the mayor is here somewhere, and the police department. They provided security,
Thank you. This whole community has embraced our entire team, and I cannot thank you enough. We've all been away from our families, 2 hours away from our families for the past 2 months, and it's this community that made us. We would walk into restaurants and people would come up and thank us. You know, you don't have any idea how good that makes people feel when they're under an incredible amount of stress, an incredible amount of scrutiny, and this community really embraced us. I want to thank the Colleton County Clerk of Court, Becky Hill, and her entire team and their staff. I don't know. I call her Becky Booth. That's her nickname. But Madam Clerk, wherever you are tonight,
I hear you.
I'm sorry. That's my pet name for her. But I want to thank you, Madam Clerk, for you, the entire team, the bailiffs, the court security, the staff here. There was no role that was too small that they weren't willing to do for us. The security team here, it was a Herculean effort by everybody, and I can't thank enough people. I don't know if I mentioned the bailiffs, but I want to thank them. And there's another group of people who you don't know who they are, but that's the jurors. And not just the jurors, but the alternates, the ones who didn't even get to serve to the very end, but people who were taken away from their families. And I want to thank the families of our jurors who sat here every single day for what seemed like long amounts of tedious, monotonous information and evidence. Sometimes people didn't know what it meant. They didn't understand it. And they had to sit there and process it and hear it over and over and over again. And I want to thank these nameless jurors whose identities have been protected. They may make their identities available to all of you at some point, but they sat there and they delivered justice tonight, and I want to thank them for their role in this process. Amen. You know, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other kind. I kind of want to adopt that and say we may have the worst criminal justice system in the world, but it's better than every other kind that there is. And our criminal justice system worked tonight. It gave a voice to Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, who were brutally mowed down and murdered on the night of June 7th, 2021 by someone that they loved and someone that they trusted. And they couldn't be here to testify for themselves tonight. Their testimony came through the evidence and the information that was gathered by the men and women of the agencies I've just mentioned. It came from the testimony of the agents and the investigators and the attorneys and the folks in our staff who were able to get it to the court record. And so I want to say tonight, their voice was heard tonight and justice was brought for them. We can't bring them back, but we can bring them justice. Amen. Amen. I started off my remarks by saying that it is a good day in South Carolina. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Today's verdict proves that no one, no matter who you are in society, is above the law. Amen. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord. A lot of people doubted that this process would work, and hopefully, for those who did doubt the process, hopefully we have instilled and put a little bit of faith back into you and your lives as you view this process as it unfolds. I'm proud of this team. I'm proud of the men and women standing behind me tonight. And there's been a lot of emotion. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I saw firsthand for the last 5 or 6 weeks the countless nights where you were up beyond midnight and you were getting up before dawn, not eating. I was watching Nancy Grace the other night and I heard her call Creighton pale and gaunt because Creighton wasn't eating and sleeping. He really wasn't, folks. I'm serious. So, you know, we would have to bring in kind bars and things to eat during breaks. But Creighton, Herculean effort, my friend. And I am truly honored to have you on our team. Thank you for being a great leader and a great chief prosecutor. And I would like to invite you to come up here and make some remarks for the folks here tonight.
Thanks, everybody. And I want to start by thanking this guy who's given me and all these folks behind us opportunities to do justice, which is what we want to do with our careers. It is very tough and demanding, but it's rewarding for moments like these. The general stole a lot of my lines, but I also want to thank the jurors for their long and arduous service. And we had no doubt that if we had a chance to present our case in a court of law, that they would see through the one last con that Alex Murdaugh was trying to pull. And they did, and we're so grateful for that. I get to lead the state grand jury section in the Attorney General's office. This particular case is not a state grand jury case. There are other indictments that are state grand jury. But the one thing about that is that I have an amazing team, and I want to be clear, this was a team effort. Y'all saw all of these folks behind me doing amazing work, and I can't be prouder of a team in my life. We called this our Super Bowl, and not because of the media attention, but just because of the effort that we knew that we would have to put into this. And we didn't really get to watch much of the Super Bowl that went on because when we arrived, I think it was winter, and it feels like spring now. But every single member of this team, every single member of the state grand jury staff, what we do well is work together as a team in complex investigations, and who we work with is my partners at SLED. And I can't thank them enough as well, because we're used to working on these complex cases and working together. And I'm not leaving out Sheriff Hill and the Colleton County Sheriff's Office and our federal partners in Orangeburg and Charleston Sheriff's Office and all the other agencies that have worked on this case. I also want to thank Miss Becky, if she's still up there, because she's been amazing. The clerk staff has been amazing. The court staff has been amazing. The bailiffs have been amazing. And again, I also want to thank this community who really has embraced us and has been so great to us and made us able to survive this process that has been long and arduous. And I haven't been sleeping. I hadn't been. And I have been eating more than Kind bars every now and then. But, and I'm sure that's a nice plug for Kind. But anyway, it really has been a great process. We will have sentencing tomorrow. Obviously, we're not going to comment on sentencing because that's still pending. But justice was done today. It doesn't matter who your family is. It doesn't matter how much money you have or people think you have. It doesn't matter what you think, how prominent you are. If you do wrong, if you break the law, if you murder, then justice will be done in South Carolina. And I think South Carolina has shown to the nation and the world how a process can work and work well. Thank y'all.
And also, I want to thank Creighton. I told Creighton, I said, Creighton, I'm going to come down and I'm going to be just a staff attorney. I know I'm your boss. I'm your boss's boss's boss, but I said I'm going to come down and I'm going to help. And I said I'm going to follow instruction. And I hope I was true to my word. This past weekend, I was saying, what can I do to help? I said I'm willing to take a witness if it'll help. He said, actually, it would. So he let an old prosecutor dust off his cleats and get back in the game and to help the team out. And
I got to be the boss of the boss for a while.
Yeah, so don't get used to it.
I'm not used to it.
No, but in all seriousness, I'm proud of the decisions that I made in putting the people behind me and to the left and right of me in charge of this case, and I was honored to be part of this team. Just another member, just another worker bee in the trenches trying to bring justice to the people of this state, and to bring justice to the people who couldn't be here tonight because they were brutally murdered by someone they trusted. Now, with that being said, I know a lot of people want to talk to us. A lot of people want to talk to some of the attorneys and the support staff and the agents, investigators here tonight. Some of you want to talk to me and others. We're going to make ourselves available to you. But like Mr. Waters just said, tomorrow there's a sentencing hearing, and we don't want to get out in front of our skis. And plus, I'm starting to feel the rain come down. But I promise you, we're going to make ourselves available to talk to members of the media, to talk to all of you out there that have questions. We'll answer any questions that we ethically can. We hope you'll continue to be patient with us as we finish this process tomorrow. Again, we're all going to go back and get a good night sleep tonight. But again, thank you. I'm going to also, one last group that we didn't thank, the media. You all, I know a lot of people in this polarizing world we live in, a lot of people take shots at the media, but the media was incredibly respectful. You were so good, not just to us, but listen, to the families of the victims, okay? I know this is an awkward situation, but you protected the identities of people, and you protected the process, and I want to thank you for your part in this and telling the stories, educating the public on what's going on out there. So now I'm going to stop speaking as an attorney general, and I'm going to close as a father and as a husband to say that when you go home tonight, hug your loved ones, Amen. Hug your spouse, yes. Hug your children, because this case reminds us of anything that you can't take for granted that people in your family are always going to be there. And right now, when I get home tomorrow, I'm going to hug mine, and I hope you hug yours. But Amen. Thank you again. Thank you for your prayers. Yes, sir. Thank you for your prayers. You came and prayed for me. I see a lot of people come up and say we're praying for you. Yes, we appreciate your prayers. Thank you all so much. And this is going to conclude this press conference. We look forward to talking to all of you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, as promised, you heard that entire news conference from the Attorney General. Before we wrap up our live coverage for today, we will be back tomorrow from sentencing. Just final thoughts from the crew out in the field, starting with our expert trial analysis, trial attorney Carl Grant.
The jury's spoken, they've finished their job. Tomorrow morning, Judge Newman has to finish his.
Greg?
And we shall see. Gotta say, the Attorney General said it very clearly. A great day in South Carolina. Nobody is above the law here. The process played out. It was a process that, honestly, for everyone involved, it was a long 6 weeks. For these prosecutors themselves, they stayed at the Hampton Inn here in town.
They did.
While the defense attorneys stayed in some very high-priced accommodations, but they put in the work and got the verdict that they worked so hard to achieve. They said that ultimately justice prevailed, and justice prevailed for Maggie and Paul Murdaugh in this case.
They did indeed. And in listening to the Attorney General, Alan Wilson, I heard a message to the defense team today, because they said, the prosecution said, they blasted us for trying to do our job. And Alan Wilson made a point of commenting about SLED tonight and the incredible job that they did. Not a perfect investigation, but doing their job ethically and responsibly. And Creighton Waters closed it out saying, it doesn't matter who you are, what power or influence you might think you have. If you do wrong, and especially if you murder someone, you will be held to account and there will be justice. That is what we have seen tonight with Alex Murdaugh being convicted in the murder of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul, convicted of murder and of all 4 charges that he faced here at the Colleton County Courthouse. Our live team coverage continues tomorrow morning with sentencing here on WIS and WISTV.com. On behalf of the entire crew, Greg, Nick, Carl, everybody behind the scenes to bring this live streaming coverage to you possible, thank you so much for joining us and for trusting us for your coverage. We'll have much more here on WIS and WISTV.com.